For example, until quite recently, the foreign minister, whoever was the foreign minister, was also the party secretary at the ministry. Now, for the past 2 years, perhaps, there is an experienced party functionary who has been brought in as the party secretary at the ministry. And as you know, in the Chinese system, the party secretary of any entity occupies a very high position. In fact, he or she is the equal of the head of that institution. My second question is that in March 2018, China carried out a major reorganization of a number of its entities, its institutions. And China doesn't experiment easily with these kind of changes. One of those changes was that a new Central Commission on Foreign Affairs was created for the first time ever. How is this entity functioning? Of course, it's very, very hard to figure out because given the opacity of the Chinese system and the fact that these kind of issues are not discussed on the pages of the People's Daily or whatever, and first-hand research of the kind that SIPRI carried out. SIPRI carried out a pioneering research in 2008, I think, and produced a fine document on the foreign ministry, which is available on its website. Those kind of activities no longer take place. My third question, a very brief one, is that the kind of aggressive diplomacy that China practiced in 2019, 2020, and even parts of 2021, which was mislabeled as wolf warrior diplomacy. I don't think it was wolf warrior at all. It was rather short-sighted, needlessly aggressive, needlessly offensive, but that has undergone some change. Would they agree with me? For example, Lithuania, which has experimented with a new official arrangement with Taiwan, while still recognizing the PRC, was strongly attacked for this action because China is very, very sensitive on this particular question. But of late, we don't read much about this. Have they come out to some, have they worked out some kind of an arrangement? If anybody has any information on that. Anyway, I've gone on for long enough. I give the floor straight away now to Wenjing Gao, who's the first speaker. Ma'am, we will, the time available to each speaker is 15 minutes. And at the end of 13 minutes, if you don't mind, I will give a little warning to the effect that 2 minutes are left. Please, Wenjing Gao.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Rana. So let me share my screen first. I do have a PowerPoint. Oops. All right, can everyone see it? Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's really good to be here to see some of my old friends, and I'm of course looking forward to meet new ones as well. Actually put a little bit more weight on China's domestic policy rather than its foreign policy. Well, because there's a little bit miscommunication, but so please bear with me. But I believe me and Dr. Tiwary will even bring more perspectives, especially the depths of the ontological security studies as well as the width of the empirical data. So, my the title of my presentation is about the China's dynamic zero policy in 2022, the insurmountable challenge of the ontological security. And my initial empirical puzzle came from questioning China's lockdown in the recent Omicron hits. As we all know that the world has already suffered the 3 years at the hands of the global COVID-19 pandemic. According to the CDC, the current Omicron variant is more contagious but less pathogenic than earlier variants of the virus than the that caused COVID-19. The countries with high risk of vaccination, such as the US, the Canada, the UK, and even India, have already started incrementally easing and removing virus restrictions. And the whole world is suffering from the COVID fatigue and is striving to restore a normal social and business order. Meanwhile, virus places in China, such as Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Beijing, have been putting strict and rigid restrictions under the name of the dynamic zero policy, which effectively placed the local population into enforced confinement. Consequently, the economic activities in the region cease. So why are both approaches such opposite? Well, that naturally brought to my research questions how to interpret Xi Jinping's administration's strict COVID response in the context of the global reopening, and what is the Chinese government saying and actually doing to overcome this crisis, especially as Xi aims to start his third term, and what are the consequences of rigid pursuing the ontological security of Xi's rule. So my arguments are Chinese government's excessive COVID response is a reaction of pursuing its ontological security, and Xi's search for the ontological security in the lead up to the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party stretches the boundaries of governments of the China's city's capacity in ways which, rather than secure the region and the leadership of the party, may compromise it along with China's rise. So I'm going to apply the ontological security studies to analyze the Chinese government's response. So here are the key definitions that I will elaborate with a concrete analysis and the empirical data later. So this research will be conducted in a qualitative way. The first-hand and second-hand source, such as government reports, official speeches, and academic articles and newspaper pieces, will be applied, and I will also use the discourse and analysis. So Giddens defines the ontological security as the confidence that most human beings have in the continuity of their self-identity and in the constants of the surrounding social and material environment of action. It signifies having a consistent sense of self and having that sense affirmed by others. So in international relations, the concept of the ontological security typically refers to, according to Jennifer Mason, security not of the body, but of the self, the subjective sense of who one is, which enables and motivates actions and choices. It thus denotes Giddens' words, security as being rather than security as survive. So the ontological security is the desire of actors to having a constant self and to have such sense affirmed by others. Essentially, ontological security lies in the maintenance of an identity stability. It accounts for the identity threat. So a stable identity is presented by the state through a continuous and coherent discourse and practice. It is crucial to provide a cohesive biographical narratives to maintain ontological security in the in the discursive sense. The biographical narrative, in Giddens' term, the narrative of the self, stories by means of which self-identity is reflectively understood, both by the individual concerned and by others. So all states justify their actions, even when such actions compromise existing international principle. States talks about their actions in identity term, and this is necessary because only in the telling of the event does it acquire a meaning, the meaning that makes such event politically irrelevant. Those specific telling which links by implication a policy with a description or understanding of a state self constitute a state biographical narrative. Actors must create a meaning for their actions to be logically consistent and coherent with their identity of the past, present, and future. This means that the state agent must explain, justify, or argue what a policy would mean about their sense of self-identity. So I lay out two levels of analysis, which are discursive and behavior level, for manifesting how China is pursuing ontological security. So in terms of Communist Party of China, the core narratives to legitimize its rigid COVID response is to maintain its biographical narrative under the discourse of the supremacy of the people and life first. So as she said, China have adhered to the supremacy of the people and life, effectively responds to the COVID-19 pandemic and protected people's life and health to the maximum extent. And CCP's biographical narratives is always to portray, to put the people's interest first. From Mao's famous political slogan, the CCP is from the people, to the people, and its goal is to serve the people. And the first two sentences of the constitution of the CCP has also clearly pointed out that the Communist Party of China is the vanguard both of the Chinese working class and of the Chinese people and the Chinese nation. It is the core leadership. It is the core of leadership for the cause of the socialism with Chinese characteristics and represent the development trends of China's advanced productive forces, the orientation of China's advanced culture and fundamental interests of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. Because of the CCP's priority is to put the people's life first, so its COVID response is being painted as the policy of greater benevolence. The connotation of this is for achieving long-term strategic goal requires sacrifice, and sometimes this sacrifice was painful. So nevertheless, the policy necessary to achieve these goals, however they might lead to short-term misfortune, could be considered benevolent. So on the individual level, Xi Jinping has already successfully enshrined his thought in the constitution of the Communist Party and becoming the most powerful leader since Mao. And in 2018, the National People's Congress, China's legislature passed an amendment to end a two-term limits on the presidency, which allowing Xi stay on power unlimitedly. He has been praised as the backbone, the pillar, the lighthouse, and the world-class leader. So Xi expected to renew his second term of office in the coming 20th National Congress of the CCP. It is the most sensitive and crucial time for his safe reappointment. So China's COVID-19 policy directly under his wise and understanding superior leadership has to be carried out successfully without any questioning and blaming. So otherwise it will damage his self-image as the superior leadership, as well as CCP's credibility, even legitimacy. So for maintaining a cohesive biological narrative to achieve ontological security, actors is seeking to routine their relations with significant others. The deep uncertainty renders the actor's identity insecure. The nation states seek ontological security because they want to maintain consistent self-concept, and the self of states is constituted and maintained through a narrative which give life to routine its action. So those routines can be disrupted when a state realizes that its narratively actions no longer reflect or are reflected by how it sees itself. When this sense of self-identity is dislocated, an actor will seek to re-establish routines that can, once again, consistently maintain self-identity. So here I distinguish two levels of significant others for the CCP. Domestically, it is the Chinese people. Internationally, it is the Western world led by the United States. So no matter the internal or the external significant other are, the CCP is seeking to routine its relations with its significant others via reaffirmation and differentiation. So for the domestic significant others, as I demonstrated in the previous slide, the CCP is keeping reinforce its biographical narratives to its people by bonding and symbiosis. For bonding, I mean, it always highlights its creation is the products of the people, and as well as the source of legitimacy of the region is in the hand of the people. At the same time,
excuse me, but you have just 2 minutes left now, please.
Okay, emphasize the symbiosis between the CPC and the people. Okay, since I only have 2 minutes left, I don't think I can even finish it because I thought the presentation going to be 15 to 20 minutes. So briefly, the external significant other of the CCP is the Western world led by the US, and the CCP maintain is the binary, always maintains binary narratives on its COVID policy. On the other hand, defending its own COVID policy is the step of pursuing economic and social development, which aims to reach the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, while at the same time differentiate its own policy with the US by making a comparison and keep distant to the US COVID policy, which is responsible for more than 1 million people's death. And this is a way to reflect its superiority of the system of socialism with the Chinese characteristics compared to the US democracy. So meanwhile, blaming the rest of the world who dare to pointing the finger at its own COVID policy. Even its own people's criticizing has been labeled by the collusion with external forces or being used by them. So I do have like 3 or 4 examples for that from the Xi Jinping's opening Xi Jinping's speech, which openly attacked the Western democracy, as well as the foreign minister Wang Yi, which also blames the U.S. Establish an Indo-Pacific version of NATO, and also as you mentioned just before, is the wolf warrior diplomacy, which Zhao Lijian, the foreign ministry spokesman, which directly defend China and blaming the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros' speech about to avoid making irresponsible remarks and to review China's COVID-19 pandemic objectively. So on the behavior level, there are 3 mechanisms which if I don't think I have enough time, which I have three mechanisms to for analyze the China's behavior to pursuing ontological security, which is referring and performative defense and deference and the obstructive resistance. Okay, so I don't think I can elaborate on that, but the consequences of the China's ontological security on its own COVID-19 policy, which is the unsustainable social and economic cost, and is the more worstly is the losing trust and credit and the confidence to the party's rule and economy, and at the same time is a great opportunity for the countries such as India and Vietnam to substitute to China's vacancy. Okay, here we go. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My apologies for having hurried you a little bit, but in fact, you have gone on for about 17 minutes. Okay, the next speaker is Dr. Rityusha Tiwary. Rityusha, please step in. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. And my apologies at the start because I again have a very problematic internet connection. So I'm keeping my camera off and I have informed the organizers. That's the only way to be able to connect right now. So
Sure.
Again, apologies. So my paper is titled as India-China Border Dispute During the Pandemic, the Ontological Security Concerns. The India-China border dispute flared to unprecedented levels during the pandemic in 2020. And the traditional security approaches, which center around the material, national, and state-centric rationales of territory, strategic interest, security, and conflict, have not been able to sufficiently explain the fact that dispute continues and manifests its violent nature amidst the worldwide pandemic when India and China engaged in a bitter standoff at the line of actual control. The border dispute represents a deep anxiety and concern surpassing the momentous calamity of the pandemic, highlighting some key ontological security concerns that need closer examination for effective redressal of the dispute. So my paper raises the following questions. What does the border represent for India and China? How to understand the response of the two states to the border dispute during the pandemic? What are some of the key concerns of ontological security that emerge in this case? And finally, the paper explores India and China's anxiety continuum and selfhood in a redefinitional kind of a way at the border to elaborate upon the ontological security framework, thereby giving the concerns of the two states refocus and reprioritization of key elements in border security. So in the first part, we can discuss the background of ontological security as it emerges in the phase. The COVID-19 crisis has posed a fundamental challenge to global security, and yet this extends well beyond the economic and physical security of the states in the context of the nation states, how they look at it. Indeed, it has posed a fundamental challenge to the notion of human security or the survival of human as a subject. It has also provided analytical category to more critical approaches to security, where security has been understood as survival, but in a disjuncture from that kind of an understanding, security came to be known more as survival plus, or some freedoms from life determining threats and therefore space to make choices. So Ken Booth extended that kind of an argument. And if you look at that kind of an argument in the context of India-China conflict, it doesn't really bode well, because the summer of 2020, in fact, proved to be a specimen of threat that the border security/insecurity poses opposite to the lived experience of being at the border, which is often understood as the ontological security, which may shed further light on intractable nature of India-China border dispute. And to extrapolate primarily from Anthony Giddens, ontological security in this case would be how ontological security emerges in the case of a person, and then it is extended to the notion of the state, how from persons' ontological security, we derive the ontological security of states. So for Giddens, simply persons' fundamental sense of safety in the world and a basic trust of the other people, and obtaining that trust in order to maintain a sense of psychological well-being and avoiding existential anxiety is what is ontological security. If we extrapolate that in the case of border studies, in the case of India-China border specifically, it would be in terms of managing the importance of a continuous narrative or the sense of self, which could be found in the ability of the two states to keep the narrative of the self going. And in an ontologically secure state, we can bracket out the questions about the selfhood, the others, and how do we how do we not objectify, but how do we exactly locate the object of the other in the world? And in that sense, in this process of locating the other, there is a sense of being taken for granted. There's a sense of keeping the normalization of everyday activity. So this taken for granted is what provides the deference or provides the anxiety, freedom from anxiety. And when taken for granted situation is moved away from the situation of normal, this is when the threat or the critical situation arises, which is what Galwan represents in the case of India and China. So the question that I raise and discuss is, what does the border represent for India and China? And therefore, from this background of ontological security, what are the concerns that can be underlined? And my proposition in that sense is that in this particular reference is that India-China border, if we look at this particular case study, the being or the self is separated from lived experience, which gives the border the status of a dehumanized entity. So there is a marked separation of the being from the lived experience. And now if we go into the historical trajectory, the India-China border has retained its dehumanized character with sporadic accounts of crossing over by travelers separated by centuries. So the very dehumanized character has been because we haven't seen too much of a humanization, too much of a lived experience coming from across the borders. All throughout various state-led initiatives at the border, the building of the infrastructure, the movement of troops, direct military action, political, economic negotiations, the human account has remained a very subsumed category in this state-led narrative around the border. And the initiatives that I just mentioned have merely reproduced borders' contingent nature and role as superior to the human lived experience, the human interest. And therefore, instead of producing, reproducing, or modifying the degrees of borderness, what has happened is that there is a constant continuum of dehumanization of border in case of India and China. Border and borderness have become intractable, impregnable, and mysterious entities which are devoid of human element, have adopted strong anti-ethnocentric posture. Border negotiations, therefore, have also retained the Westphalian definition of border, making settlement possible only in terms of territory. And the nature of India-China border dispute is therefore overwhelmingly territorial, and negotiations and settlements come across as palimpsests of Westphalian peace. Indeed, it is a part of the larger trend where territoriality is defined and delimited in the case of nation states, which has kind of emerged from how the world reorganized in a post-World War era. And the territorial delimitation has helped establish and consolidate the nature of state as a rigid embodiment of power and decision-making process. And finally, in that sense, a state which is defined by borders becomes an absolute case, non-negotiable, inarguably territorially oriented, and therefore poses a very central problem in terms of interstate relations, so far as any kind of resolution of border conflict is concerned. So, and I'm not going to get into the part of my paper where I look into the history of negotiations. I'm just going to present a summary of that. Anyone who's looking at India-China border, one is quite well versed with the history of negotiations in that sense. And if we look at a brief overview of the negotiations, the mechanisms, the nomenclatures which have been applied to resolve the disputes underline the non-approachability of border from a human angle. The approach towards border negotiations and settlements is very mechanical in that sense, and dehumanized, which is devoid of analysis of people-centric issues, where border ceases to be a relational space, a lived space, one which can be defined by lived factors or live factors, as it were, and acquires the characteristics of a very absolute space, one that remains a priori to human concerns and actions. And this is very reminiscent of Newton-Leibniz debate regarding nature of time and space, how it is well beyond the human experience, and therefore, in a sense, it means that it is a very dehumanized time and space. Finally, in the final part, and I'm going to skip a lot of discussion that happens in the sense of the border map making. I'm looking at a reorientation, a reprioritization, and refocusing of the border, whereby I kind of propose to explore the border as a lived being through ontological ethnographic security approach. And in this section, what I do is look at border from these two approaches, raising the ontological security concerns, and therefore applying the ethnographic security approach. Borders are necessarily evoked in geopolitics and interstate relationships, and significant lengths of human identity and interactions such as gender, race, class, and ethnicity are mostly subsumed within the meta-narratives of state-centric analysis. The social, cultural, national, regional, global, and personal realms that intersect at border need to be studied, analyzed, and remodeled from human angle. And to break the intractability of India-China border dispute, this is perhaps one of the possible frameworks while approaching the border. And the application of critical ontological security and critical ethnographic lens at the same time would require initiatives to engage in comparative analysis of the border on either sides in order to construct knowledge and make meaning of the border from the point of view of experiences of the communities and individuals that inhabit the borderlands, which is inclusive of actually the experience of the military personnel which are deployed throughout the year, year after year. And to look at this lived experience would mean that established hierarchies of identity would need to be overcome. And such reductions can only epistemologically prove sometimes dangerous, because it might lead us to believe that we know what we do not know. So when I say that established hierarchies of identities need to be overcome, there is a framework of knowledge exchange which is required from multiple levels, and the epistemological danger that we face, that we might believe what we know is true, whereas it might not be the case. The ontological security framework would mean that the ways of seeing and inscribing what we see and then what we inscribe and ascribe to the border are not separated from the social locations of the people, as well as the people who are living at the border. And these hierarchies have many a times been expressed through visible identities such as gender, race, state versus people, etc. And also through much less visible identities such as political allegiances, religious beliefs, or the level of education, and so on and so forth. The social locations and identities may have blinders, and therefore crossing the border may still not lead to understanding or the knowledge of the border fully, but understanding or knowledge cannot be produced without border crossing. So border crossing becomes one of the...
Rityusha, please.
Yes, so border crossing becomes one of the important aspects, and a remodeled version of border as a possible site of interaction between lives of people, nature, systems, and institutions is necessary in that case. The questions raised by geopolitical borders, even under globalization, are real, and therefore must be examined by bringing to fore the people-centric notion of security, lives, and livelihood, which brings us back to the idea of ontological security. And the positionality of settlement in that sense is to basically turn the gaze back on deciphering settlement, peace, or the framework of conflict resolution via lived experiences. And I'll stop here in terms of leaving more space for questions, perhaps. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Rityusha. You saved at least a minute. Thank you very much. Manoj, you are the discussant, and you, sir, have about 12 minutes to pose your queries, questions, and observations. Manojji.
Right. Thank you so much, Ambassador. And thank you so much to Wenjing and Rityusha. I think both of the presentations were really, really interesting. And I have a bunch of notes that I took. I want to first start with Wenjing's presentation. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to speak a little bit about my thoughts on both the presentations. And I have a few questions. And then I'd like to just talk a little bit about my view on what has been China's foreign policy approaches during the pandemic and thereafter, although the pandemic is not over. But yeah. So firstly, to Wenjing, I mean, I agree with your proposition that yes, there has been far greater centralization. Xi Jinping has sort of personally staked his legitimacy in many ways to this policy of zero COVID. And yes, there is an aspect of pitching this policy as not just distinct, in many ways distinctly Chinese, an example of the product of the superiority of the system and a demonstration of that, and sort of comparing it with the United States, and not just the United States, but with other countries also, to argue that this is a much more superior approach. Along with that, in the last few months, we've seen the argument being made that you need to stick to this dynamic zero COVID policy because it's also economically the best approach. Instead of looking at short-term economic gains, it's rather better to deal with the short-term pain because containing the virus over, is much better than dealing with mass infections and the implications that that may bring, not for the economy, but also from a social stability point of view and from a governance point of view. And that's the argument that's being made with, there's limited scientific. There can be scientific quibbling over that, whether that's feasible going forward as we see more variants coming out. And I think we're seeing some level of adjustment happening in that policy also. But how far does that adjustment take place is something that we have to see. I agree with your view also of the idea of, bonding and symbiosis that you projected. I mean, I would just like to add to that to think of, I look at China today under the Communist Party under Xi Jinping as a deeply increasingly ideologically driven system with increasing top-down control. And there's a framework that I would propose that you can probably potentially consider, which is that ideological systems work on three prongs: faith, fear, and fruits. How much of faith has Xi Jinping been able to generate across society and party in his policies and in his leadership is a matter of contestation, but it's clearly larger than what it was for Hu Jintao. But that's one aspect. Fear, of course, there's tremendous fear that he's been able to create through the use of the anti-corruption campaign amongst the elites, but also suppression across society, across civil society. And fruits, the argument is that if you peg your economic model for even the private sector with the party's objectives, you're likely to be far more, your work is likely to be far more fruitful. And this is for the cadres as well as the private sector. So it's a useful framework for you to think of, I thought. The final thing is that I'm not necessarily as much in agreement with you on the issue of China's challenges in the short run and the benefits to countries like India and Vietnam. I honestly think we've not seen significant outflows of capital from China. I don't think we've seen significant outflows of exits by Western companies, Japanese companies from China. So I'm not necessarily certain that that benefit has accrued. Yet there is a benefit that's accrued, which is in the context of sectors which are deemed much more important from a strategic or security perspective. And I think the Quad's agenda that you see and India's engagement with the Quad on specific aspects on new technologies tells you that in that context, yes, there has been benefit, but not necessarily in the case of just mass exit of Western companies from China. I don't think that's likely to happen in the near term also, despite whatever we've heard. But yeah, just some things for you to think about. On Rityusha's paper, I mean, honestly, I thought this was a fascinating presentation. In some ways, it's a very grim prognosis, although hopeful, but it's a very grim prognosis of the state of affairs currently. I had actually a couple of questions for her, which probably she can address later on in the session. Is firstly, how much of the India-China border issue and the sort of lack of focus on other narratives is a product of also, and the possibility of those narratives to exist is also a limitation of geography in itself, but also the nature of the ideological differences between the two states and how much of that limits that particular aspect to come across. And secondly, have you seen similar narratives of of that people-centric narrative with regard to other borders of China? Because my sense is that it's been much more sort of state-led, security-led. So just two sort of questions for you to hopefully answer down the road. But yeah, I thought it was a fascinating paper. On sort of my views on Chinese foreign policy, I just have a few points to make. Firstly, I look at what's happened in the last 2.5 years from the perspective of, I mean, at the top of it, I would keep the idea that China's big strategic goal, the Communist Party's big strategic goal, is national rejuvenation. And I think a lot of policy is animated in a sort of broad perspective, aiming towards that target. At the same time, I think that there's a peculiar interplay of insecurity and confidence that you constantly see in Chinese foreign policy. And that's partly because foreign policy is essentially an extension of domestic policy. So you're likely to see this intense anxiety coexist with confidence bordering on hubris. And I think we've seen that over the last 2.5 years. So when Jing said something to the effect of how you're comparing China's COVID policy to the American COVID policy, you're making the case that our system is better, yet there is an intense anxiety of any little thing going wrong. And those sort of coexist with each other. Within that framework, I think if you look at the worldview of the party, there's a basic sort of structure that I have. One is that, from at a domestic level, there is tremendous growth and there is tremendous confidence in that growth and the material power that growth has generated. There is a greater sense of unity among the party. In terms of the Xi Jinping's effort to sort of remold the party under his control. Yet, and the history resolution at sixth plenum told us this, where he spoke about how, we've addressed the laxness and the weakness that existed, although challenges still exist, but it's, a much more sort of significant strength has been developed. Yet there are challenges of governance, there are challenges of popular legitimacy, and there is a need to restructure the economic model, which is sort of described in the context of the changing principal contradiction and the move towards high quality growth. Externally, Beijing views the world as a much more contested place, which is not necessarily a bad thing because that brings opportunities and threats. It views its relative power having significantly risen. And it views the world from the perspective of three deficits, which is a deficit in governance, development, and security. And again, these bring challenges and they bring opportunities. So how has it responded to all of this? In a nutshell, domestically, there's been a intensified focus on ideology, on top-down control. This is across the party cadre, and this has been structural through reshaping of internal party regulations. Increasingly, if you go through any regulation issued, you'll see Xi Jinping thought being the guiding ideology. And that's not just, I don't think that's just rhetoric. I think that's also, that's something that gives an animating mission to the party. It gives a framework. And I think that's important as more people pledge to it and as more documents refer to it. It tells you a little bit about that top-down control. The use of technology to ensure compliance at local levels is another aspect of that top-down control. A product of all of this is that there is tremendous policy rigidity. There is less experimentation. There is less ability to adapt because of the fear. And therefore, you see policies which are being applied, which even get criticized by the central government. For example, last year you had the coal shortage in China, which led to a lot of criticism from Xi Jinping himself, saying, "Well, you shouldn't be doing campaign-style initiatives." Yet he's also requiring people to move towards a much more environmentally friendly energy model in the long run. So there's a certain contradiction which creates much more difficulties for the party to actually achieve its objectives. From an economic policy point of view, there's an effort at restructuring the model. This is towards, this sort of flows from the idea of the new development philosophy, which has 5 prongs, from being open to being green to being innovative, to have shared economic growth and things like that, which is requiring new commitments from the bureaucracy and from the private sector. For the private sector, we've seen that massive churn over the last year and a half or 2 years with regard to common prosperity. And my anticipation is that is going to continue.
Manoj.
Sure, sir. So I think that's going to continue, and that shift in the Chinese economic model will continue. I think this current phase of the pandemic has hit it badly. But I don't think the program is entirely derailed. I think this is a structural change. It is going to continue, which means that the engagement with the world at large is also going to change. China's economic model will require it to engage with the world in a different fashion and offer different alternatives for economic engagement with different countries. Finally, externally, what we're seeing is because of this sense of anxiety, confidence, hubris, yes, sense of weakness, opportunities and threats, we are seeing a response which is of far more confidence, because your growth and your material advantages have given you the opportunity to project national power and to shape the external environment. At the same time, the external environment is also being largely shaped because of this ideological and systemic confrontation, which is making it far more, which is making you far more insecure. And that window of opportunity that you see that the Chinese spoke about for 20 plus years has been shrinking. And Beijing feels that you need to act much more assertively to be able to keep that window ajar as much as possible. And I think that's why we are seeing far more projection, far more outreach to the developing world, and much more emphasis on security, for example, what we saw in the BRICS summit. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manoj. So friends, here we have it. From Wenjing Gao and Rityusha Mani Tiwary, the 2 speakers, we have had a comprehensive explanation of what ontological security is and their approaches to this. And Manoj has posed a number of questions, observations of his own, and comments. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have learned a little from this event. I now understand what ontological security means. Now, this prompts in my mind a very simple question, which I pose to the 2 speakers. Most entities don't go around with a sense of being threatened vis-a-vis their self-identity. So the very notion of ontological security implies an intrinsic insecurity on the part of that entity. It amounts to really insecurity over its own self. How is it that all entities don't have that fear? I'll give you an example. China talks endlessly about the century of humiliation. And it is factually correct. But here is India, which suffered under British rule for 3 centuries. And somehow the narrative, the concept of a century or 3 centuries of humiliation has never been part of the political idiom or the dialogue in India. Is it that we are insensitive, that we, in spite of everything, we still love the British so enormously? Or is it that we don't have that fear of our self-identity being compromised. So we don't need to find ways and devices to prop up that identity with these myths. I mean, the century of humiliation is really a myth, because most of Africa, large parts of Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia could also talk about their long centuries of plunder and looting by the colonists, but we don't go on about it. So, doesn't this tell you something? Frankly, as far as Rityusha's paper is concerned, can we not find simpler explanations? That China has exerted great pressure on India in Ladakh, on the Himalayan border, and earlier in the Bhutan sector via Doklam, essentially as a means of exerting pressure on India, political pressure, diplomatic pressure, and security pressure, really. I mean, can't we just look at the simpler explanations? These are a few thoughts that come to my mind, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I think the best course might be that if in 2 minutes, and really, please, 2 minutes, if Vanjing Gao and Rityusha Tiwary might respond to the comments made by Manoj, and then we will go to the questions that have been posed. We have 3 so far, no more, 4 maybe 5 in the chat box, and we'll go to those. I hope this is a process, this is a method that you may be willing to consider, that you may be willing to accept. And it is my intention to end today's session at 20 minutes past 7 o'clock. That is to stick to more or less a time limit total of 80 minutes. If that's okay with you, Vanjing Gao, would you please like to comment in 2 minutes on what Manoj has said, followed by Rityusha? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Ambassador Rana and Manoj. I really appreciate your questions and comments. To address Manoj's suggestions and the questions, the part that that Manoj doesn't agree. I think I should bring more empirical data in terms of the quantitative research, like the concrete, like the trade data, or from Vietnam as well as India, to maybe support my argument, but until now I have a hard time to find it. Maybe it's not even coming out from other research, because this COVID lockdown is still some parts going on in China. So the consequences maybe is we don't know yet, right? So maybe I have to wait a little bit, or maybe do some more depth research to find the data to support my argument. But I do appreciate, Manoj, your 3F, phase and fear and fruits. That's kind of gave me more organized perspective to fit into my research about these this ontological securities concern, and especially the consequences. This is of course is a working paper, so there's a lot of things I have to think and consider to make a big progress later, and to address the Ambassador Rana's question about the 100 years humiliation. I think that's, the difference between China and India's response about their self, perceptions of its own, they both have a very bitter colonial time, but why the self perceptions are such difference. I think I would argue that because China historically have since Qing dynasty. So Qing dynasty, the Emperor Qing already conquered the most of the especially the north part of the China. So it's already formed a very strong government compared to India. But this kind of strong government is persistent, going on for the since BC, since 221 BC until now. So there's dynasty after dynasty, but always conquered by the great unified and central governments. That's why they already the government, the Chinese government or the Chinese emperor already organize its have a very clear, the self and the others to telling the stories of who they are and who others are. So but historically India doesn't. India is just arguably speaking, of course, is a geographically conception. It doesn't have a very unified and big government. So that's my perspective. And anyways, so I think that's my answers and my.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vanjing. I think you are in accord with Winston Churchill, who also said that India is no more a country than the equator. I think you imply that. Rityusha, 2 minutes, please.
Yes, so very briefly to respond to Manoj's propositions and also questions, how the limitations of differing ideologies proposes a kind of detriment to border settlement. I think the limitation in terms of ideological differences is what propels India and China to take different kind of roles in the region. The search of partners in the region and how they propose to even approach the border resolution differs in terms of the ideological differences. So that's that's something that has been explored in the sense. Even Vanjing talked about how the self or the perception of the self is very different in the two cases. And all of that is historically, ideologically correlated. The second thing, whether we've seen certain people-centric approaches, I'm not very sure if that framework can be explored in totality in context of China-Myanmar border, but I think that's one of the possibilities. I mean, looking at the borders, and not just China-Myanmar, even China-India, India-Myanmar can also kind of explore that framework in terms of borderland villages. So that's that. And why to apply the approach at all? In that sense, again, just two statements in that particular regard. Ontological security or ethnographic lens basically provides or enables a very emancipatory analysis of the border or borderlands or periphery. And in the context of India-China border, there is a possibility of readdressing the inevitability and intractability of dispute due to the rigid, dehumanized notion of border that has been there in continuum. So it enables a strong recasting of modern borders and brings to fore the hybridity of the lived experiences or the multiplicity of lived experiences across the borderlands. So breaking the impasse in the non-linear cultural transmission of border and borderlands. So that's one way of exploring the borders, which may break the continuum of a rigid, dehumanized notion of border. But then, why can't things be simpler? If things could be simpler, we wouldn't have to really talk about India-China border. Okay. In this fashion for so many decades. Very briefly to Professor Patricia Oberoy's comment, the shared focus on ontological security and anxiety. Yes, Vanjing Kao and myself, we are already working together in that sense as a part of our ontological security framework elsewhere. So we thought it would be a good thing to kind of bring it
Rityusha, you're jumping ahead to
and
question.
I mean, what Professor Oberoi very rightly points out as the anxiety of the communities living. I mean, it's the ontological anxiety of the communities living, which is living at the borders, which is quite different from the centrist perspective. That, yes, of course, and therefore the multiplicity, the pluriversal sense of self and anxiety, which could be explored through the lived experiences, which is what I focus on. The continuum from Anthony Giddens' framework till date as to how ontological security has come to be applied in interpretations, I think, yes, I mean, there are a lot of scholars who we have kind of looked at, Steele or Kinneville, or very recently Croft and Midson. They've been looking at ontological security in the sense of certain extrapolations and derivations from Giddens, but they have kind of expanded on the framework much more. So I agree to the proposition of Professor Oberoi that we need to explore that together more.
Thank you, Rityusha. I think you made your point. I think we can stop there. Let's go to the questions. Although you've already jumped ahead with Patricia Oberoi's question. There are two questions for Wenjing Gao. One is focuses on the 18th Party Congress. That's the Party Congress that brought Xi Jinping to power. And it talks about as the most important in his presidential term and its effect on India-China foreign relations and trade. And the second question for Wenjing Gao is that in the case of COVID and China, the fact remains that the state continues to distrust people, adopts a paternal, even patronizing attitude that is a routinized relationship that the CCP has formed to give the party a sense of identity. I think that's a rather complicated way of posing the issue. Isn't it that China has really said that they want to pursue a zero COVID policy at a time when everybody around the world, including New Zealand, which also tried that policy, has given up on it? But anyway, I leave it to the two speakers to respond. It's really Wenjing Gao who may please respond to these two questions that have been posed. Thank you very much.
Okay, Ambassador Rana. I appreciate those questions. I will address the second one first. So whether this is, I don't think that's the CCP's coherent, narratives from the get-go. Because as I mentioned in my argument, in my PowerPoint, that CCP always have, so the difference is the self-perception and others' perception on you. It's like, make a easy example, like I pursue myself as a doctor to be, but maybe other person pursue me as a doctor. So that's a difference. So in here, the CCP is always, claim that they are the People's Party, they are for people, they are, serving the people, but maybe on the other side, from the other's perspective, it is, distrust and adopt, a different attitude to rule. So that's a short answer. And for the first question, I think the question, as just before the Ambassador Rana already corrected, is the CCP's 18th Congress. That's the most important because it's actually, it was wide speculated that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang would succeed Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao at the top Politburo Standing Committee. So in that CCP's National Congress, and then take over the presidency and the premiership in the coming next year's National People's Congress. So that's a short answer. And the effects of the 18th Communist Party's Congress on the Indian and China foreign relations and trade. Well, actually, as I remember correctly, since the beginning of the Xi Jinping, I mean, get appointed and succeed, India and China at that time have a relatively peace and close relationship compared to nowadays. So the previous Chinese foreign policy is take Deng Xiaoping's binding their time. So there's no much like today's wolf warrior diplomacy and more aggressive. But before wasn't very aggressive. So but after Xi Jinping take over the power, and especially after it secures the remove the unlimited term, so it's getting to more and more aggressive. So that's my short answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Patricia Oberoi has several questions, partly answered by Rityusha. And really, it would be very difficult for me to try and summarize her questions. But obviously, you're getting into a very somewhat technical discussion, which may not be easily understood by everyone. So maybe if you have time, Patricia, maybe you can put your question directly yourself in speaking to the two questioners. But before that, may I jump ahead and say that Manoj has responded to some of my comments initially, and I'll get back to my comments right at the end of the session. Yukti Panwar has a question about China's territorial and maritime borders and the impact these disputes have with its neighbor as seen through the lens of ontological studies. That's an interesting point. Maybe somebody would like to respond to that. Maybe Rityusha would like to talk about that. And there is a question about, I think I'll stop there. Rityusha, would you like to comment to the question put by Yukti Panwar?
I think Dr. Tiwary might be facing connectivity issues.
Sorry, Rityusha, is there a connection problem? Okay, to save time, Patricia, would you please go ahead and summarize your question in 3 sentences or so, if possible? Thank you.
Well, no need to summarize because Rityusha has done that and responded. I did want to applaud them trying to bring a fresh perspective. And the only question I really wanted to ask is the ontological anxiety the property only of the centrist nation states concerned, or do the local people at the borders also have it, have such anxieties, in which case that's part of the ethnographic approach that they take. And also I wanted to say that Ambassador Rana's 3 questions were not, naturally, of course, not addressed by the 2 speakers. I think they, except just now Ms. Gowin comments and Manojji in his comments also written and otherwise, I think one needs to also look at these practical and administrative issues and how they're playing out in the contemporary context. And I hope that will be part of taking this initiative further. That's all.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for the absolute clarity with which you have addressed these issues. We really are almost out of questions because we have some flowers presented to the 2 speakers by Nuno Miranda, who says no questions, wanting to thank the 2 speakers and the event organizers. And Shruti put in a plug for the next Wednesday seminar. Since Rityusha did ask me, let me give you my very brief take on the 3 points I made. First, with regard to the reorganization that was carried out in China in 2018 of its administrative structures and the creation of the new commission, as Manoj has said, there is no information in the public domain really about how this commission has been functioning, and we really know nothing at all about what's been going on. The second question I'd posed was the why of stronger party control over the foreign ministry. Nobody has commented on it, and I don't think this question figures very much in the public discourse. And I'm a little intrigued by this, but who knows, maybe there are others working on this. And my third point was about this aggressive diplomatic style. Manoj is of the view that this style has not changed, it remains as it was. I'm not sure if that is the case. Take Lithuania. When it was first announced that Lithuania was going to permit Taiwan to set up an official office of some kind, not an embassy, but an official presence, there was a great deal, there was a very angry response from Beijing. Lately, as far as I know, there has not been any substantive comment on this subject. And this is what leads me to think that maybe that style has softened. I want to remind you also that in 2020, when the dispute with Australia was extremely sharp, the Chinese actually published a list of 14 points, I think it was, on which they felt that they had been given offense by Australia. I mean, a kind of public exposure to a series of substantive complaints about how Australia had offended China. It's the very antithesis of diplomacy. I mean, you don't go around embarrassing another country with that kind of a public list of your grievances. Firstly, countries don't make a list of grievances. At least in my limited knowledge, I have not come across such a list that one side presents to the other and says, you so-and-sos have hurt us and offended us because of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, going on to what, 14 points or 16 points. That's not how diplomacy is conducted. But we don't see that happening very much today. Maybe Manoj may have a response to that. Okay, we've now kind of run out of questions. So we still have 3 minutes. I do want to end at 19 hours, 20 minutes. So if anybody has a very quick question, please jump in.
Ambassador Rana, if I could just address the points that you
Sure,
raised.
please.
So first thing on the personalization of foreign policy and the structure that exists today. I think a recent really good paper was by Professor Suisheng Zhao, where he talks about the shift in Chinese foreign policy, and that paper is available publicly. I'll try and drop a link here for anybody who's interested. The second question on Lithuania, I think that we need to look at this approach to foreign policy, this aggression and assertion from the point of view of outcomes and continuum. At the end of the day, there is a performative element to it. And the performative element is to try and see if you can coerce the other. And then there comes a point of time where you start to look at outcomes from the point of view of what is it that you can achieve at subsequently. Now, when you know that your performative anger has had limited impact, you're imposing other restrictions. So, for example, China-Lithuania trade today has basically sunk. There is no trade, and it's not like there is any easing happening. So while the verbal tirades may have stopped, the actual tightening of the relationship continues. Likewise with Australia, at present, I think that we're in a phase where there's a new government and there is a certain element of feeling out. Yet the directionality of that relationship hasn't changed, neither from the Chinese point of view, neither from the Australian point of view. And just the economic relationship tells you that it's not necessarily changed. So I think we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I mean, I sort of subscribe to what Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's argument that, Beijing tends to view some of these things from the point of view of a continuum. The actions are aimed at a desired end, and you will adapt tactically at different points of time. That doesn't mean necessarily the assertive nature of foreign policy has shifted. For example, you went to the South Solomon Islands, you went to the Pacific Island nations, and you proposed a different deal. You've made some headway, and you'll push more. So I think, and now we are seeing the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative. So you'll see a lot more push. It's just that the approach may have slightly changed, partly stylistically a little bit, because the world has become a little bit more different since February 24th.
So in a way, Manoj, the world is also becoming a slightly better place, because in the process of responding to China, some good new ideas are being developed, and that's probably a good thing. Anyway, I think this is as constructive a point at which one might end a conversation like this as anything else. So thank you very much indeed to the two speakers, to the discussant who has also brought a great deal of insight into this subject. And I want to leave the two speakers who are obviously going to continue to work on this ontological security issue, that, I don't think one should abandon the, intellectual gymnastics are always wonderful to watch. And this is what is, in a way, partly being done. But there is a common sense element that also needs to be kept in view. Why is it that most entities around the world, countries, don't worry about threats to their self-identity? I mean, don't you think this is a question that you should also ask? France doesn't worry about where itself is. France is a very, very individualistic country in many respects. You know that very well. France doesn't lose sleep over it, doesn't come out with long documents or tirades on what others have done to hurt its self-identity. And so many other countries around the world. Which African country worries about its self-identity? I mean, I can't immediately think of an example. So I would say, go a little bit, keep a larger perspective in view. And then this business of inhabited people and the contested lands, etc. The simple fact is that in the heights of Ladakh, there are no people. There are no grazers. There may have been at some point in time that there were people who grazed their sheep or whatever in some of those wastelands. But they are so high that barring a few months, maybe in the summer season, there is nothing to graze. So quite unlike the Northeast, our eastern border, the eastern sector, that's entirely different. But in the northern sector, the western sector of the India-China border, there are in fact almost no people who are wandering around those areas. And Panditji said this very openly also in that delightful, not a blade of grass statement of his. Anyway, I've gone on for too long. My apologies, 3 minutes over time. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you to the people who have stayed. At one point we had 37 people attending a rather esoteric discussion of this kind. So obviously ICS is managing to attract eyeballs and listening ears as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ashok. Thanks to the two speakers, to Manoj and the organizers. Thank you very much. We can now end this.